Man's best friend was not saved from man's weirdest taxes. Between 1797 and 1798, Scotland introduced a fixed tax of 5 shillings on all non-working dogs. The tax caused a controversy soon after it was introduced. People against the tax complained that dogs were being considered objects and not living creatures. Supporters argued that dogs ate food and used other amenities that would have been used by humans, so they should be considered luxuries. The tax was proposed in 1796 by John Dent, the Member of Parliament representing Lancaster. Dent was heavily criticized and mocked by other members of Parliament and the press for even thinking of taxing dogs. They even nicknamed him Dog Dent. The tax was not meant to rid Scotland of dogs, though people may have killed the dogs they could not afford to pay tax on. There were lots of non-working dogs running around Scotland at the time. They spent their time chasing people around and were generally considered a nuisance. The money raised from the tax was intended to be used for the poor.
The first beard tax was introduced by King Henry VIII of England in 1535. King Henry VIII had nothing against beards, and he didn't really need the money. In fact, he kept a beard himself. He was only interested in turning beards into status symbols. The amount to be paid was dependent on the status of the bearded person. The higher the status, the larger the tax. King Henry VIII later abandoned his beard tax, but Queen Elizabeth I reintroduced it when she became queen. She imposed a tax on any beard that was left to grow past 2 weeks. In 1698, Peter I of Russia introduced a tax on beards and mustaches in an attempt to stop men from keeping beards, just like other Europeans. Everyone who paid the tax was issued a special silver or copper coin called a beard token. They were required to have the token with them at all times. Men who did not have the token or refused to pay the tax would have their beards shaven in public. The tax was repealed in 1772. Canada used to have a special tax for Chinese migrants. The tax was included as part of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 that initially imposed a tax of $50 on every Chinese citizen coming into Canada. The act was part of the anti-Chinese sentiment that was building up in Canada at the time. Chinese citizens were entering Canada and taking jobs that could have been performed by Canadian citizens. The Chinese were also willing to take lower pay, which made some employers hire them en masse. The tax did not deter the Chinese, and they continued to enter Canada. So, the tax was increased to $100 in 1900 and $500 in 1903. The Chinese still kept coming. The tax was relaxed during World War I when Canada became short of manpower. However, the anti-Chinese sentiments that flamed the act quickly returned after the war. Many Canadians were angry because the Chinese were now becoming landlords. Nevertheless, they still came in despite the high taxes. Canada got fed up and introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923, banning all Chinese from coming into Canada. The law was partially repealed in 1947 and finally abolished in 1967. The window tax was one of the weirdest and most hated taxes in England. Introduced in 1696, it was initially payable only by landlords of houses with 10 or more windows. While the exemption was intended to protect the poor, it only helped the poor who lived in personal small houses in the villages. The poor in the cities lived in big rented apartment buildings with more than 10 windows. The landlords paid the taxes on the windows and increased rents in response. To avoid these payments, some landlords bricked up the windows of their existing houses and built new houses with insufficient windows. The landlords could not simply reduce the size of the windows because even the smallest hole was counted as a window and taxed accordingly. As more landlords bricked up their windows, the law was amended to reduce the minimum number exempted from the tax from 10 to 7. This forced landlords to brick up more windows in the already poorly ventilated homes. 6. The tax was very unpopular, and people soon started speaking up against it. Doctors blamed the poorly ventilated homes for the increasing cases of diseases like cholera and smallpox. The tax was finally repealed in 1851, after decades of protests and public backlash. Britain introduced a tax on hats in 1784. Every hatmaker within London paid £2 a year, while hatmakers outside London paid £5. These hatmakers were required to have the statement dealer in hats by retail above their doors so that the taxman would easily recognize their shops. 10. Hatmakers who paid the tax were issued some stamps that they were to affix to their hats. Anyone who bought or sold a hat without these stamps could be arrested. Some hatmakers tried gaming the system by forging their own stamps. A man named John Collins, who was caught red-handed forging hat stamps, received the death sentence.